On the 10th of January 1475, a valley crusted with ice in eastern Moldavia was littered with the bodies of Ottoman soldiers. Their 45,000, strewn across miles of blood-soaked snow, the most powerful empire on earth, had lost half its conquering force in a single day. They had come with 120,000 men, Janissaries who conquered Constantinople, cavalry who crushed the Balkans, artillery that breached fortress walls from Anatolia to the Danube. They outnumbered the Moldavians 3-1. By sunset, they were fleeing for their lives. This was the Battle of Vaslui, one of the most catastrophic military defeats in Ottoman history, and you've probably never heard of it, because the man who planned this victory understood something most generals don't. Empires can't be defeated by being stronger. They can be overcome by making conquest too expensive, and Moldavia's Prince Stephen II was willing to burn his own country to the ground to prove it. Before we begin, I have a small favor to ask. If you value what we do here, history unvarnished, just the pure human decisions that shaped our world, please hit like and leave a comment. It really helps this video reach people who are just as fascinated by this as you are. That's all. Now, let's go back 22 years to the day the world changed forever. The 29th of May, 1453. The walls of Constantinople, standing for over 1,000 years, walls that had repelled Persians, Arabs, and hordes of barbarians, fell in less than 2 months. The man who broke them was 21 years old. Sultan Mehmed II had inherited the Ottoman throne at 19. He was seen as too young, too ambitious, too reckless. His father's generals doubted him. European kingdoms mocked him. Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI believed God himself would protect the city. They were all wrong. Mehmed brought something no previous commander had. 70 cannons, including the monstrous 7-foot-long basilica that fired half-ton stone balls capable of punching through 12 feet of wall. He brought 80,000 troops, a fleet that dragged ships overland to bypass blockaded harbors, and a cold, methodical patience that broke any defense. When the walls finally fell and Ottoman soldiers poured in, Constantine cast aside his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets like a common soldier. His body was never identified. Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia, which had been the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity for 900 years, and ordered it converted into a mosque. He stood inside the building as he made this decision, without hesitation. The message was clear. This wasn't just conquest, it was erasure. Christian Europe was in shock. Constantinople wasn't just a city. It was the idea that the Christian world had a shield in the east. That shield had been destroyed, and the Sultan who shattered it was only beginning his journey. For the next 20 years, Mehmed's armies moved like a flood. Serbia fell in 6 years, Bosnia in 10. The remnants of Byzantine Greece were absorbed. Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler's land, was conquered and made a vassal state. Its princes paid tribute and submitted to Ottoman authority. By 1475, the Ottoman Empire controlled the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Black Sea coast. They had the world's best-trained infantry, cavalry capable of fighting as both archers and shock troops, and a logistical system capable of supplying armies hundreds of miles from home. They hadn't lost a single major campaign in a generation. And now, only one Christian territory stood between them and complete control of the Black Sea. A small, cunning country called Moldavia. Moldavia lay between the Carpathians and the Dniester. 400,000 people, mostly Orthodox peasants and minor nobles, scattered across forests, river valleys, and hills. It wasn't rich. It had no grand cities or legendary fortresses, but it had something the Ottomans craved: geography. Control Moldavia, and you control the northern Black Sea trade routes. You cut off Poland from the south, you encircle Hungary, you turn the Black Sea into an Ottoman lake, with no single Christian power able to stand against you. It was the final piece of the puzzle, and Mehmed II knew it. But Moldavia had survived this long for a reason. It wasn't about strength, but positioning, surrounded by predators on all sides. Ottomans to the south, Crimean Tatars to the east, Poland to the north, Hungary to the west. Each was strong enough to crush Moldavia alone, so Moldavia played them off against each other. An alliance with Poland when Ottoman pressure increased. Tribute to the Tatars when Poland became hostile. A careful, grueling dance of survival that demanded perfect timing and no mistakes. One wrong move and Moldavia would have vanished, like Serbia, like Bosnia, Like every other principality that thought it could negotiate with empires, Moldavia had avoided fatal mistakes for 18 years, as its ruler possessed a unique understanding of the principles empires operated by. Unlike most other princes, he realized their respect was earned not with strength, but with the price you were willing to pay. His name was Stephen II. In 1474, he made the decision to make the Ottoman Empire pay. Stephen II had gained power in 1457 through violence, a common affair for rulers in the region. His predecessor, Peter II, was a usurper who had taken the throne through murder. Stephen needed an army to reclaim his throne. So he went to Wallachia and struck a deal with a man no one else in the region wanted to deal with. Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, known as the Impaler. Vlad provided him with troops. Stephen marched into Moldavia, defeated Peter's forces, and executed him. He was 24 years old at the time. However, unlike Vlad, who chose terror as his policy, creating forests of impaled prisoners and nighttime raids to intimidate, Stephen chose a different approach. He meticulously studied every Ottoman victory. Stephen analyzed the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the Battle of Varna in 1444, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. He understood how the Janissaries fought, how the Sipahi cavalry maneuvered, how Ottoman artillery functioned, how their supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. He reformed Moldavia's army. The core was the Kurteni, professional soldiers personally loyal to him. He trained them constantly, instilling modern tactics and coordinated action. He built fortresses at strategic points like Suceava, Niemps, and Hotin, not to hide behind, but to serve as anchors for his defense while his mobile forces struck. And he forged alliances, with Poland when northern security was needed, with Hungary for support in the west, even with the Crimean Tatars when the situation demanded it. He made promises to those willing to believe him and broke them as soon as they became liabilities. It wasn't a matter of honor, but of survival. By 1474, Stephen had ruled for 17 years. In that time, he had fought Tatars, Hungarians, pretenders to the throne, and Ottoman raids. Most of these fights he had won not through superior numbers, but by choosing when and where to fight. And he came to one conclusion. It was impossible to defeat the Ottoman Empire in open battle on their chosen ground. They had too many men, too much experience, too many resources, but you could inflict enough losses that they would leave you alone. In 1474, Stephen decided to test this theory. He stopped paying tribute to the Porte. Then he invaded Wallachia, defeated the Ottoman vassal prince, and installed his own man on the throne. It was a deliberate insult, a direct challenge to Ottoman authority. Mehmed II received this news in Constantinople. The Sultan who had conquered the unconquerable city, who had never tolerated defiance, who saw resistance as an invitation to annihilation. His response was immediate, a full-scale invasion, not a raid, not a punitive expedition, but total conquest. And the man he sent had been at the walls of Constantinople when the city fell. Stephen knew what happened to princes who dared to defy the Ottomans. He had seen what happened to Vlad. Vlad II of Wallachia, a former ally of Stephen, had stopped paying tribute and launched a campaign of extermination against all Ottomans in his territory. Not just soldiers, but merchants, diplomats, civilians. He burned them, drowned them, boiled them. And those he wished to make examples of, he impaled. Mehmed II responded personally, leading a 90,000-man army into Wallachia to crush the rebellion. Vlad knew he couldn't win a conventional fight, so on the night of June 17, he launched a desperate assassination attempt. He led a select detachment of cavalry straight into the Ottoman camp near Targovishte, searching for Mehmed's tent in the darkness, trying to kill the Sultan and end the war in one blow. They came within yards of success. The Ottoman camp descended into chaos. Soldiers killed each other in the confusion. Mehmed's guards fought desperately to protect him, but Vlad couldn't find the right tent. After hours of slaughter, he retreated back into the night. The next morning, Mehmed's army marched towards Targovishte, and then they saw it. A forest of stakes, stretching for a mile. 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners from Vlad's previous raids, lined up along the road in perfect rows. Some had been there for weeks, others were fresh. The smell alone made men retch. Horses refused to move forward. Mehmed stopped his army and stared at the stakes for hours. Then he ordered them to continue. For terror without strategy is just a performance. Vlad had frightened the Ottomans, but he hadn't rendered them incapable. His army was too small, his resources too limited, his fortifications too weak. Within months, Mehmed installed Vlad's own brother, Radu, on the Wallachian throne. Vlad fled into exile, hunted, eventually imprisoned by the Hungarians who had promised him support. Stephen watched all this from across the border and realized, cruelty attracts attention, but wars aren't won by it. Wars are won by making your enemy doubt if the prize is worth the blood. 12 years later, Stephen prepared to put this lesson into practice. For the man Mehmed sent to destroy Moldavia was the same commander who had fought beside him at Constantinople. He was Hadum Suleiman Pasha, governor of Rumelia, a veteran of 20 years of Balkan campaigns. He advanced with a force that dwarfed anything Stephen had ever faced. In the winter of 1474, an Ottoman army mustered in Bulgaria and Wallachia. Under the command of Hadum Suleiman Pasha were between 100,000 and 120,000 men. To grasp the scale, this was one of the largest Ottoman contingents sent into Europe in the 15th century. Larger than the army that took Bosnia and superior in numbers to the force that crushed Serbia, this was not a punitive raid, but an extermination operation. At the core of the army were the Janissaries, boys taken from Christian families, converted to Islam, and raised from childhood as elite infantry. They fought with muskets, crossbows, and blades, operated in disciplined formations, and died without breaking. They were the ones who breached the walls of Constantinople when all other units failed. On the flanks rode the Sipahis, provincial cavalry, skilled horse archers who could shoot accurately at a full gallop or charge with lances like European knights. They were paid through the Timar system, land grants in exchange for military service. Their loyalty belonged to the Sultan and the land they received. Then came the vassals, Wallachian contingents under Basarab Laiota, a man Stephen had tried to depose, Serbian auxiliary units, Bulgarian levies. These men bore no love for the Ottomans, but they had families in occupied territories, and defiance meant death. And finally, the Akanchus and irregular raiders, whose job was simple: ride ahead of the main army, burn everything in their path, sow terror, and break the enemy's will before the real battle began. Suleiman Pasha's plan was clear. Move north through Moldavia in 2 columns, devastate the countryside, force Stephen into an open battle where numbers would decide the outcome, and then besiege the fortresses until Moldavia capitulated. However, there was one detail that set this invasion apart from the typical Ottoman summer campaigns: timing. Suleiman was advancing in winter, in the heart of winter, with snow, frost, and frozen rivers. Traditionally, armies didn't conduct campaigns in winter. Too difficult to supply, too hard on the soldiers, too unpredictable. But Suleiman was banking on winter catching Stephen off guard. Poland couldn't send reinforcements over snow-choked mountain passes. Hungary wouldn't risk its army in freezing conditions. Stephen would be isolated, unable to fully mobilize, forced to fight alone. It was a brilliant decision, except for one problem. Stephen wanted to fight alone. Stephen had 40,000 men, less than half of what Suleiman led. The core of his army were the Curtini, professional soldiers Stephen maintained personally, paid, trained, and trusted. They were his main striking force. Then came the Vetsi, minor nobles and their retinues, obligated to military service in return for land. They were competent, but their loyalty belonged first to their estates, and then to the prince. The largest group were the Razashi, free peasants who owned their own land and fought for it. They had no formal training, but they knew the forests, the rivers, the hills, and they understood perfectly what Ottoman conquest meant. Slavery, forced conversion, their children taken into the Janissary Corps. This made them the most dangerous fighters in Stephen's army. Stephen had spent 17 years preparing for this moment. He had studied every Ottoman victory, every tactical formation, every strategic decision, and come to one conclusion: never fight them on open ground where their cavalry could maneuver. Never let them choose the battlefield. Never give them a chance to use their numbers. So, when his commanders gathered in December 1474 and asked how they were to defend against 120,000 men, Stephen gave an order that made half of them question his sanity. Burn everything, not just military supplies, but everything else. Villages, crops, livestock, granaries, evacuate the population north, poison the wells, destroy anything the Ottomans could use for sustenance or shelter. One of his boyars, a noble who had fought alongside Stephen for 10 years, stood up. "You ask us to destroy our own country." Stephen didn't blink. "I ask you to choose between rebuilding and enslavement." Suleiman is leading 120,000 mouths to feed, and tens of thousands of horses that need fodder. They are invading in winter because they think we are unprepared. So let's make winter our ally. We will deny them food, shelter, and an easy target. Let every kilometer north cost them men, morale, and time. And if it doesn't work, then we were dead anyway. Silence fell in the room, because everyone understood Stephen wasn't telling them everything. This strategy demanded suffering from Moldavia's citizens. Families would lose everything. Some wouldn't survive the evacuation. Villages that had stood for generations would disappear. But the alternative was watching those same families dragged south in chains. That night, Stephen II gave the necessary orders. By the time Suleiman's army crossed the Danube at the end of December, Moldavia was already ablaze, and the Ottomans were marching into a frozen wasteland. In late December 1474, Ottoman troops crossed the Danube and advanced north into Moldavian lands. The first day, morale was high. This was supposed to be a swift campaign, a repeat of the successes in Serbia, Bosnia, and other Balkan principalities that had fallen to the Ottoman onslaught. The soldiers expected resistance, then collapse, plunder, warmth, and victory before spring. By day 3, they discovered the first deserted village. Every building was ravaged. No food, no livestock, no people, only ash where granaries had stood. In the well, something rotted, deliberately thrown in. Dead animals. The commanders sent scouts ahead, who reported the same thing. Village after village. Each abandoned, each burned. No civilians, no supplies, nothing. Suleiman Pasha assumed Stephen II was in a panic, retreating and destroying what he couldn't defend, a desperate, futile gesture. Ottoman supply wagons trailed all the way from Wallachia. They had brought provisions for the campaign. It was an inconvenience, but not a crisis. Then the temperature plummeted. The winter of 1474–75 proved exceptionally harsh, even for the region. Deep snow, biting winds that spared neither wool nor skin, frosts that blackened fingers. The Ottomans moved without shelter, without hot food, and without any idea where the enemy was. The Janissaries maintained their discipline as always, but the vassal contingents began to grumble. Wallachian troops, already unenthusiastic about invading fellow Orthodox Christians, started to suffer. The horses of the Sipahis, bred in warmer climes, struggled through snowdrifts. Men began to fall ill. Yet Suleiman continued north. They had come too far to turn back from mere discomfort. Then the raids began. Moldavian horsemen, light and swift, clad in winter gear, emerged suddenly from the forests. They attacked Ottoman foragers, killed a dozen men, and vanished before a response could be organized. Then they appeared 5 miles away an hour later and repeated their actions. The Ottomans tried to pursue them, but to no avail. The Moldavians and Razashi knew every deer trail, every frozen stream, every place where the forest was too thick for heavy cavalry. By the time Ottoman troops organized a pursuit, the raiders were gone. It wasn't just the losses, but the exhaustion. No one could sleep properly. Every shadow could hide an ambush. Foragers required armed escorts, which slowed everything down. Scouts stopped returning. Suleiman's intelligence ran out. He knew Stephen's army was somewhere to the north, but where? How many? Were they preparing to defend a fortress or planning an ambush? He had no answers. By early January 1475, the Ottoman army had advanced over 200 miles into Moldavia. They had not engaged in a single major battle, yet they were already taking losses, without ever meeting Stephen's main force. 120,000 men require approximately 200 tons of food daily to remain combat effective. Horses, tens of thousands, need fodder. In winter, in a land where there was nothing left to take, Suleiman's supply line stretched over 200 miles back to Ottoman territory, through snow, hostile terrain, forests where Moldavian raiders destroyed wagons and disappeared. Rations grew smaller, and then smaller still. Soldiers began slaughtering horses for meat, not the war horses, those were sacred, but the pack animals, which meant reduced carrying capacity and thus even less food reaching the front. Men began dying, not from battle, but from cold, starvation, dysentery spreading through camps where sanitation had ceased, as no one had the strength to maintain it. The Wallachian vassals were the first to break discipline. Some deserted outright, risking execution because freezing to death in Ottoman service seemed worse. Others simply stopped obeying orders with the same zeal. Why die for an empire that had brought you here? Even the Janissaries, trained from childhood to endure any hardship, began to falter, not in combat readiness, but in the look on their faces, gaunt, emaciated, silent. And throughout all this, the Moldavian raids continued. A foraging party ambushed here, a supply depot burned there, never a major engagement, just constant, debilitating attrition. Suleiman realized what was happening. His army was bleeding out without ever meeting the enemy. By the second week of January, he reached a vast area. Hilly terrain, scattered forests, frozen streams cutting through valleys. Defensive terrain, but not insurmountable. And then his scouts brought a welcome report. Stephen's main force had been sighted. Not retreating, not hiding in fortresses, but deployed, ready for battle. Suleiman's officers urged caution. The army was weakened, under strength, demoralized. Perhaps they should consolidate, wait for spring, or retreat to establish a proper supply base. But Suleiman knew his own position better than his officers. If he retreated without victory, Mehmed II would literally have him beheaded. The Sultan did not forgive failure, especially from commanders who had promised an easy conquest. If Suleiman besieged a fortress like Suceava without supplies, his army would starve at its walls. If he continued his march north, more men would die each day from cold and hunger, and eventually, the army would simply collapse. He had only one option: provoke a decisive battle, crush Stephen's army with superior force, and end this nightmare before it consumed them all. So when Stephen offered him battle at Vaslui, Suleiman accepted the challenge. He had no idea that Stephen had spent 3 weeks preparing for this very moment, that every burned village, every poisoned well, every ambush of foragers had all been planned to bring the Ottoman army to this place, at this time, and in this condition, emaciated, starving, desperate. On the 10th of January 1475, the valley. 2 armies lined up against each other, and Stephen was about to show Suleiman what happened when you waged war on foreign soil. The battlefield Stephen had chosen was a valley near Vaslui, about 2 miles wide, with wooded hills on either side. The frozen Barlad River cut across it diagonally, and the sloping hills, which appeared open enough for cavalry, were not. The Moldavians occupied the high ground at the northern end. Infantry was positioned along the tree line. Artillery, though scarce, was placed to fire down the slope into the valley. Cavalry, invisible from below, hid in the forests on the flanks. The Ottomans deployed in lower positions, using their standard formation: Janissaries in the center, a dense block of professional infantry, Sipahi cavalry on the flanks, ready to wheel around and envelop, vassal troops in reserve, artillery to support the advance. On paper, it was an exemplary formation that had crushed Hungarian armies at Varna, Serbian forces at Kosovo, Byzantine fortifications at Constantinople. But paper doesn't account for emaciated men, half-starved horses, and terrain that only appears favorable. Suleiman stood with his commanders, studying the Moldavian positions. His officers saw what they expected: an outnumbered enemy forced to stand and fight. The math was simple: 120,000 against 40,000, a 3-to-1 ratio. Even weakened, such odds should be decisive. What they didn't see was the land itself. The valley floor was uneven. Snowdrifts hid pits, frozen stream crossings that looked solid but could collapse under weight, scattered scrub that would break a charge. The slopes weren't steep, but enough to slow a cavalry charge uphill. And the forests on the flanks weren't just trees. They were hiding places for any number of Moldavian cavalry Stephen had concealed there. Stephen stood on the high ground, watching the Turkish army deploy with his senior officers. One of them, a young man named Stephen Basyok, looked at the mass of Turkish troops filling the valley below. We're outnumbered 3-to-1. Stephen didn't take his eyes off the Ottomans. They have marched 200 miles through winter without food or rest. Look at their formations. See how slowly they move. See the gaps between units? This isn't an army. It's a mob held together by discipline. And if their discipline holds, then we will make them break it. In the early morning, the temperature was below freezing, breath visible in the air. Both armies waited. Then Suleiman gave the order. The Akinchus moved first, irregular cavalry, lightly armored, designed to probe defenses and draw the enemy out. They charged up the slope towards the Moldavian vanguard, shouting, firing their bows. The Moldavian infantry prepared. Pikemen in front, crossbowmen behind. A few arquebusiers, handheld guns, slow to reload, but devastating at close range. The Akinchus hit the Moldavian line and were immediately repulsed. Crossbow bolts punched through light armor. Arquebuses fired with a deafening crack, spooking the horses. Pikes caught riders who came too close. The Akinchus retreated, regrouped, and tried again. The same result. They didn't break through. Suleiman watched from his command post. The reconnaissance had failed, but it gave him the intelligence he needed. The Moldavian vanguard was dug in, but not deeply, perhaps 5,000 men holding forward positions, with the main line behind them. If they hit them hard enough, they would break. He gave the order for a general assault. Drums. The Janissaries began their advance, a disciplined, dense formation, moving up the slope in coordinated blocks. These were the men who had stormed the walls of Constantinople under cannon and Greek fire. The Moldavian defensive line shouldn't even slow them. The Sipahi cavalry on the flanks began their flanking maneuvers, circling the valley slopes to envelop the Moldavian positions. The commander of the Moldavian vanguard, one of Stephen's most trusted officers, watched the Janissaries approach. Thousands of them, professional, unstoppable. The orders were clear. Hold the line to the last, then retreat. Let them think they are winning. The Janissaries closed to within 100 yards. 50 Moldavian crossbows and arquebuses opened fire. Men fell, but the formation didn't waver. They continued their advance. Contact in the valley. The clang of steel. Shouts. Orders from officers in Turkish and Romanian. The Moldavian vanguard fought desperately. Pikemen held the line. Swordsmen filled the gaps. The wounded continued to fight, understanding that an early retreat would ruin everything. For 20 minutes, they held their ground. Then the commander signaled. The Moldavian vanguard began a tactical withdrawal. Slow and controlled, they fell back towards the main line, making the Janissaries pay for every yard, but withdrawing. The Ottoman commanders saw this as the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Suleiman saw it too. Push them, don't let them regroup. The Janissaries surged forward, and behind them, anticipating victory, followed other Ottoman units, the vassal troops, the reserve contingents. Discipline began to fray, not break, but loosen. The soldiers pushed forward even faster, eager to be part of the final breakthrough. This was exactly what Stephen had planned. Because the Moldavian vanguard wasn't retreating in panic, they were luring the Ottomans into the bottleneck of the valley. The Ottoman center advanced into the valley, pursuing the retreating Moldavians. Janissaries in front, supporting units behind, and then, against orders, elements of the reserve. It seemed nothing could stop them. After 3 weeks of unbearable cold, they were finally achieving victory. But the land betrayed them. What looked like a level, snow-covered plain from a distance was, up close, rough and uneven terrain, frozen streams that looked solid cracked under the weight of armored men. Snowdrifts hid pits that twisted ankles and disrupted formations. The Janissaries tried to maintain their lines, but the valley compressed them. Units advancing in organized blocks were now a jumbled mass, shoulder to shoulder, unable to maneuver. Moldavian artillery opened fire. Only a few guns, but positioned on high ground with an excellent view of the valley. Stone and iron balls tore through the compressed Ottoman ranks. One shot could kill 5 men if they were packed tightly together, which they were. The psychological effect was worse than the losses. Artillery fire in close combat. The sound alone made men flinch, duck, lose focus. Officers screamed to hold the line. But it was impossible to hold a line when the man next to you simply vanished in a geyser of blood. Then the crossbowmen began to fire. Moldavian archers, hidden until now in the flanking forests, unleashed volleys into the sides of the Ottoman ranks, not random shots, but massed volleys. Hundreds of arrows found their mark on exposed flanks where there were no shields, no cover. The Sipahi cavalry on the flanks, which was supposed to be executing flanking maneuvers, found itself unable to do so. The terrain, which had looked passable from afar, was densely wooded, with scrub and snowdrifts. The horses couldn't break through, and just as they slowed, Moldavian archers picked them off. Suleiman, watching from his command post, realized what was happening. This wasn't a battle, it was an ambush. He shouted orders to halt the advance, to dig in, to retreat to defensive positions. His officers passed on the commands. Some units heard and tried to comply. Others, already engaged in fighting under fire, couldn't disengage. The Ottoman army, numbering 120,000 men and looking formidable on paper, was disintegrating in real time. And Stephen, watching from above, saw the moment he had been waiting for. The Ottoman center was disorganized. The flanks were pinned. Morale was collapsing. He turned to his cavalry commanders. Then, Moldavian heavy cavalry burst from the forests on both flanks simultaneously. Armed boyar lancers on war horses bred for the charge crashed into the exposed Ottoman flanks like a falling wall. These weren't wild charges at a prepared infantry line. Stephen had calculated it with precision. The charging units were already disorganized, already under fire, already struggling to maintain formation. The result was catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers, bunched up in the valley and unable to form a defensive square, were cut down before they could react. Lances pierced armor, horses trampled men trying to rise. The Moldavian cavalry didn't try to break through, they tried to crush, and they succeeded. The Ottoman left flank collapsed first. The Wallachian vassal troops, already demoralized and fighting men they didn't wish to kill, broke formation and fled. No dramatic speeches, no last stands, they simply ran. This opened a breach in the Ottoman line. Moldavian infantry poured through, attacking the exposed rear of the Janissary formations, which were still trying to advance in the center. The Janissaries were now attacked from front and rear simultaneously. The Janissaries tried to regroup, to form defensive positions, to hold the line, and to their credit they fought. The Janissaries were experienced warriors. They didn't panic easily, but professionalism doesn't save you from being shot. It doesn't stop cavalry charges from multiple directions. It doesn't prevent the exhaustion and starvation that stalk you as you fight for your life. Gradually, unit by unit, Janissary detachments found themselves isolated, surrounded, crushed. The Sipahi cavalry on the right flank, seeing the disaster on the left, attempted to break off their prolonged flanking maneuver and return to support the center. However, disengaging from combat is harder than engaging. Moldavian light cavalry harried them all the way. By the time they reached the center, the battle was already lost. Suleiman Pasha, from his command post, watched his army disintegrate. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Units retreated without authorization. The center was broken, the flanks annihilated, and the Moldavians didn't stop. They advanced relentlessly, giving no quarter, no time to regroup. He made the decision every commander dreads: save what could be saved. He ordered a full retreat, but retreat requires coordination, the discipline of soldiers who still believe their officers can get them out alive. The Ottoman army had none of that left. The retreat devolved into a rout. When an army breaks, it doesn't happen instantaneously. It begins with individuals. One man drops his weapon and runs, then a dozen, 100, and then entire units. Ottoman soldiers fled south, back the way they came, into the frozen wasteland. They barely survived coming through at once. No formations, no officers, just the instinct for self-preservation. Stephen's order was clear: pursue until they stopped running. Moldavian cavalry hunted them through the forests and snow. Not for glory, not for honor, but out of necessity, because Stephen understood something most princes didn't. Today's mercy, he reasoned, is tomorrow's invasion. Every Ottoman soldier who returned home was a soldier who would return with reinforcements. Every surviving officer would learn from this defeat and fight smarter next time. So there was no mercy. Moldavian riders pursued the fleeing Ottomans for many miles. Some Ottoman soldiers tried to surrender, shouting in Turkish, falling to their knees. A few were taken prisoner, high-ranking officers who could fetch a ransom. The rest were cut down. Some Ottomans tried to fight back, forming small defensive groups in the woods. They were surrounded and destroyed. Others tried to hide, burying themselves in snowdrifts or climbing trees. Moldavian infantry found them. The pursuit continued until nightfall. Torches in the darkness, shouts in different languages, the clash of hooves and steel, and the pleas of men in words no one bothered to translate. By the morning of January 11, The valley at Vaslui had become a charnel house. Bodies lay everywhere, mostly Ottoman, but Moldavian too. This victory hadn't been easy either. Blood had turned the snow into a red slush that refroze, and those unable to move froze to death where they lay. Marauders, both human and animal, were already picking through the dead. The casualty count, as far as could be determined, was staggering: 40,000 to 45,000 Ottoman dead, possibly more. Some bodies were never found, lost in the forests, or buried under snow. For comparison, this was roughly 40% of the entire invading army, lost in a single day. Moldavian losses were between 5,000 and 10,000 men. Significant, painful, but survivable. The Janissary Corps, the elite core of Ottoman military might, was annihilated. The vassal contingents shattered. The Sipahi cavalry lost thousands. Ottoman artillery, supply wagons, provisions, all captured. Hadum Suleiman Pasha survived. He managed to rally a few thousand men and began a long, nightmarish retreat back to Ottoman territory. Moldavian and Tatar forces harried them all the way. Hunger, cold, and ambushes claimed hundreds more lives. By the time Suleiman crossed into Ottoman-controlled Wallachia, he had less than half the army he had started the campaign with. He had been sent to conquer Moldavia in a single campaign. He returned with the worst Ottoman defeat in a generation, and Stephen II of Moldavia, outnumbered 3-1, had just achieved the impossible, by all accounts. He had broken an empire that could not be beaten. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine you are one of Stephen's advisors in December 1474. The Ottomans are coming, outnumbering you 3-1. An empire that took Constantinople, that crushed Serbia, Bosnia, Wallachia. Your prince tells you his plan: burn your own villages, poison your own wells, turn your people into refugees in the dead of winter, then lure the enemy into a valley and hope. Hope that starvation and cold have weakened them enough that 40,000 men can defeat 120,000. If it works, you're a genius. If it doesn't, your country vanishes, and everyone you know ends up in chains. Would you make that decision? Could you order your own people to suffer in the hope it might save them later? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how you would have handled it. And if you're still here, if this story resonated with you in a way that's different from your usual historical content, please subscribe and hit the bell, because we're not done yet. Stephen had just won a battle, but the war, that was about to get even more brutal. News of the Battle of Vaslui spread across Christian Europe like a shockwave. Messengers raced west, to Hungary, to Poland, to the Italian states. Within weeks, the story reached Rome, Venice, Vienna. A small principality, barely visible on the map of European politics, had just destroyed an Ottoman army 3 times its size. Not just defeated it, but annihilated it. Pope Sixtus IV received the dispatch in February. He read it twice, convinced there was an error in the translation. When his advisors confirmed the details, he declared Stephen II an athleta Christi, a champion of Christ, and called for Thanksgiving prayers across Catholic Europe. This was not just propaganda, it was desperation finding hope. Constantinople had fallen 22 years ago. That wound was still fresh. The Ottoman advance had seemed inevitable, methodical, professional, unstoppable. Every Christian kingdom that had faced them had been crushed or subjugated. The psychological weight of this had broken the European spirit. Vaslui changed that. If Moldavia could defeat them, perhaps they weren't invincible. Perhaps the tide could be turned. Letters flooded Stephen's court from across the continent. Venice offered trade agreements. Hungary offered an alliance. Poland, already a nominal ally, suddenly showed far more interest in upholding that alliance. Even the Papal States sent money and support. Stephen, in an instant, went from a border chieftain to a continental hero. Chronicles written in Latin, Italian, and German lauded him as the defender of Christendom. Artists depicted him as a saintly warrior. Poets compared him to Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne. He was 42 years old, and he had just achieved what every Christian monarch had been trying to do for decades, prove that the Ottomans could bleed. But while Europe celebrated, Stephen stood in the ruins of his own country and tallied the cost. Vaslui had cost him 7,000 men. The scorched-earth campaign had destroyed a third of Moldavia's villages. Thousands of civilians had perished during the evacuations. Cold, hunger, disease. For those who survived, there was nowhere to return. And Mehmed II, the Sultan who had conquered Constantinople, who had never tolerated defiance, who saw defeat as a personal insult, was still alive. Stephen knew exactly what was coming. Not a punitive raid. Not another 120,000-man expedition. Total annihilation. In the summer of 1476, 15 months after Vaslui, Mehmed gathered an army in Thrace. This time, not through subordinates. He would lead it himself. The humiliation of Vaslui was not just a military setback. It was an existential threat to Ottoman prestige. Mehmed had built his reputation on conquest. He had taken Constantinople at 21. He had crushed every rebellion, defeated every rival, expanded the empire further than any sultan before him. And now, a prince from a backward principality had just killed 45,000 of his soldiers and made him look weak. Every vassal state was watching. Every rival within the empire was whispering, "If Moldavia can defy the Ottomans and survive, why can't others?" Mehmed's answer was to form the largest Ottoman army ever sent into Europe in the 10th century. Estimates range from 150,000 to 200,000 men. Janissaries, Sipahis, vassal troops, levies from Anatolia, artillery trains, engineers, everything. His objective was not occupation, it was erasure. The orders were unambiguous. Burn every village, kill every armed man, enslave the population, salt the land, turn Moldavia into a lesson no one would forget. Stephen, watching from Moldavia, knew he couldn't win this battle the same way. Vaslui, because Suleiman's army had arrived emaciated and starving. But Mehmed was coming in summer, not winter. He had more men, more supplies, and he wouldn't make the same mistakes. So Stephen changed his strategy. He again evacuated the population, this time into fortified cities and across the border into Poland. He burned what was left to burn, and instead of offering one decisive battle, he waged pure guerrilla warfare, attacking supply lines, ambushing reconnaissance patrols, burning bridges, poisoning wells, retreating before superior forces, never allowing Mehmed to corner the main Moldavian army. It was brilliant, but not enough. Mehmed's army swept through southern Moldavia like a flood. Every village they found, even those already destroyed in 1475, they utterly devastated. Stone foundations were leveled, wells filled, forests burned. Thousands of Moldavians who hadn't evacuated were captured. Some were killed on the spot. Others were put in chains and driven south to be sold in Ottoman slave markets. By the end of July, Mehmed reached Suceava, Moldavia's mightiest fortress and Stephen's capital, and laid siege. The walls of Suceava were exceptionally strong, built on high ground and reinforced over decades. Inside were supplies, weapons, and a garrison of officers who had fought at Vaslui. They knew all too well the horrors of Ottoman conquest and had no intention of opening the gates. Mehmed set up his artillery and began bombarding. For 3 weeks, Ottoman cannons pounded the walls relentlessly. Stone cracked, sections crumbled. Assault troops tried to storm through breaches, but were repulsed with heavy losses. The Janissaries made another attempt, with the same result. The garrison didn't just defend, they made Mehmed pay dearly for every attack. Meanwhile, Stephen, with the main Moldavian army, remained outside the city, avoiding a direct battle he would surely lose. Instead, he continued the tactics he had employed all summer, wearing down the Ottomans with a war of attrition. Moldavian cavalry constantly raided Ottoman supply lines. Wagons were ambushed, foragers annihilated, wells poisoned before the Ottomans reached them. Mehmed had brought immense supplies, but the need to feed 150,000 men for weeks while besieging an impregnable fortress depleted all resources. Worse, disease began to spread through the Ottoman camp. Dysentery, typhus, the usual companions of siege warfare. And the longer Mehmed stayed in Moldavia, the more problems arose. Reports came from Anatolia of unrest among rival factions who saw the Sultan distracted. Reports from Wallachia spoke of a vassal prince making independent decisions, testing Ottoman authority. From his own camp came word of falling morale among troops promised a swift campaign, now dying of disease before walls they couldn't breach. By mid-August, Mehmed faced the same dilemmas as Suleiman 15 months earlier. He could either stay and watch his army disintegrate, or leave without achieving his objective. The difference was, Mehmed's reputation could survive a retreat if he presented it correctly. He gave the order to lift the siege, to march south, But before he left, he turned southern Moldavia into a barren wasteland. Every surviving structure was leveled, every field salted, every well filled with corpses. The message was clear. You did not win. You merely survived. Stephen, watching the Ottoman army retreat, understood Mehmed was right. Suceava had held. Moldavia remained independent, but half the country was gone, not occupied, but simply erased from the map. Villages burned in 1475 were destroyed again in 1476. Survivors of the first invasion were now refugees from the second. It was a victory. Yes, because Moldavia still existed, and that was what mattered most. Stephen rebuilt. This is what princes do after wars. They rebuild. Villages were rebuilt, though many were never resettled. Fields were replanted, though entire regions remained empty for years. Refugees returned to find only ash where their homes had stood, homes they had left twice. The chronicles record Stephen's victories. They list the battles, the casualty counts, the strategic significance. 47 years on the throne, over 40 battles, only 2 defeats. What they don't record are the names of the peasant family who evacuated in December 1474, lost their youngest child to the cold, returned in the spring of 1475 to begin rebuilding, and then had their homes burned again in 1476 and never returned. Or the Moldavian soldier who survived Vaslui, lost an arm to infection, and lived the rest of his life in poverty because he could no longer farm. Or the Janissary, taken as a boy from a Christian village, converted to Islam, trained and sent to die fighting Christians at Vaslui, whose family never knew what happened to him. Or the Wallachian vassal prince who fled during the battle, returned home, and was executed by Ottoman authorities for cowardice. His crime was refusing to die for an empire that had conquered his country. The strategic logic of Vaslui was brilliant. The scorched-earth tactics denied the Ottomans resources. The terrain neutralized their numerical superiority. The precise timing of the operation leveraged their fatigue. But strategy is clear calculation. The human cost is chaos. Every military victory in history is built on individual tragedies no one counts. A mother who evacuated with 3 children and arrived with 1. A farmer who watched his land burn twice and decided survival wasn't worth it. A soldier who did everything right and still died screaming in the snow. Stephen understood this better than most. He made decisions knowing what they would cost, and he made them anyway, because the alternative was worse. This isn't heroism, it's just leadership in a world where all options are terrible, and you have to choose the least terrible one. Moldavia survived. That was the point. That was always the point. But survival came at a cost that wasn't reflected in the chronicles or the celebrations of victory. It was seen in the empty villages, in the faces of people who had lost everything twice, in the silence of families that would never be the same again. And Stephen, the defender of the faith, the champion of Moldavia, the prince who broke the Ottomans, carried that burden for the next 28 years. Because the war didn't end in 1476. It never truly ended. The Battle of Vaslui did not deliver a death blow to the Ottoman Empire. It's important to be clear about this, as history is often mythologized. A single battle, however catastrophic the defeat, cannot break an empire that controlled 3 continents. The Ottomans returned in 1476, and their forces were significantly stronger. They invaded again in 1484 and captured the Moldavian coastal fortresses on the Black Sea. 50 years later, they conquered Hungary. They besieged Vienna twice. The Ottoman Empire endured for another 4 centuries, not collapsing. So what was actually achieved at Vaslui? Time. Years were bought, years in which Hungary, Poland, and Moldavia could strengthen their defenses, forge alliances, and build the necessary infrastructure to resist. In geopolitics, time isn't abstract. It determines the difference between meeting an invasion fully prepared and meeting it unprepared. Vaslui also revealed Ottoman vulnerabilities that were studied and then exploited by other commanders. Overstretched supply lines in hostile territory, vassal troops prone to flight under pressure, the uselessness of numerical superiority on difficult terrain, and the psychological impact of winter, starvation, and constant skirmishes. These factors weren't secret to Vaslui, but Stephen showed they could be decisively weaponized. Hungarian commanders studied the battle, preparing for their own wars with the Ottomans. Polish strategists analyzed it. Even Austrian generals centuries later, during the Siege of Vienna in 1683, referenced the principles of controlling logistics, choosing the battlefield, and forcing the enemy to fight on your terms. Vaslui became a blueprint, but its more profound impact was psychological. For 22 years after the fall of Constantinople, Christian Europe existed with the belief that Ottoman conquest was inevitable. It could be delayed, time could be bought through negotiation, but it couldn't be stopped. Vaslui shattered that belief, not permanently, not definitively, but enough to prove that the Ottomans were not invincible, that brilliant generalship could overcome numbers, that resistance was not futile. This belief, fragile but real, helped Moldavia maintain its independence for another generation. It bolstered Hungarian resolve. It gave Polish kings more leverage in negotiations. Stephen did not save Europe. He gave it a chance to save itself. And sometimes, that's all you can do. Stephen II ruled Moldavia until 1504, a total of 47 years. He was 71 years old when he died. A ripe old age by medieval standards, especially for a man who had spent his entire adult life at war. The fighting didn't stop after Vaslui. He fought the Ottomans again in 1485, 1486, 1487. In 1497, he fought the Poles when they invaded over a territorial dispute, and he crushed them too. In the Battle of Kosmanyului, he repelled Hungarian incursions. He fought Tatar raids that never ceased. He contended with rivals who believed his throne was vulnerable. Over 400 battles in 47 years, he lost only 2. Such a record is not simple luck. It is the result of obsessive preparation, ruthless pragmatism, and the understanding that survival requires constant vigilance. He relentlessly built fortresses, constantly trained his troops, perpetually reinforced alliances he betrayed as soon as they became liabilities. By the time of his death, Moldavia remained independent. That fact alone, in a region where every neighboring state had been conquered, vassalized, or absorbed, was remarkable. When he was buried in the Putna monastery, which he founded, chroniclers called him the greatest prince Moldavia had ever known, not because he was merciful or beloved by his people, but because he preserved their freedom. 5 centuries later, in 1992, the Romanian Orthodox Church canonized him, Saint Stephen the Great, defender of the faith, patron of Christian Europe. Modern Romania reveres him as one of the founders of Romanian national identity. His image appears on currency, in textbooks, on monuments. January 10th, the anniversary of Vaslui, is observed as a day of remembrance, but here, memory becomes complex. The Republic of Moldova, independent since 1991, also claims Stephen as its national hero. His image appears on their currency. His fortresses are Moldavian historical sites. His legacy is studied as part of Moldavian history. Romanians argue he was a proto-Romanian. Moldavians claim he founded Moldavian statehood. Ukrainians point out that parts of his territory are now in Ukraine. Historical figures become battlegrounds for modern identity politics. Everyone wants to claim heroes. What is undeniable, regardless of modern borders, is this: Stephen understood something most rulers didn't. Empires don't respect strength, they respect price. If you make conquest expensive enough, even the strongest empire will seek other paths. That is exactly what Vaslui demonstrated. It's not that small nations can defeat empires, but that they can make them pay such a high price in blood that the prize is no longer worth it. And sometimes, that is the only victory available. The 10th of January 1475, a frozen valley in Eastern Europe. 40,000 Moldavians against 120,000 Ottomans. An empire that conquered Constantinople, crushed the Balkans, and held Christian Europe in fear for decades, defeated not by superior numbers, not by divine intervention, but by a prince who understood that wars are won before the first sword is drawn. At the Battle of Vaslui, Stephen didn't outfight the Ottomans, he outthought them. He turned their strengths into weaknesses. Their numbers became a logistical nightmare. Their experience turned into arrogance. Their momentum became overextension, and when they finally reached the battlefield, exhausted and starving, he destroyed them. But here's what's most important. Stephen knew the victory wouldn't be permanent. He knew Mehmed would return. He knew the Ottomans had more soldiers, more resources, more of everything. He understood that one battle, even a catastrophic defeat for the Ottomans, would not change the fundamental imbalance of power. So why fight? Because survival isn't victory forever. It's the ability to hold out long enough that your opponent decides you're not worth the cost. That is what Vaslui achieved. It didn't save Europe. It didn't end the Ottoman threat. It simply forced them to reconsider if Moldavia was worth another 45,000 dead men. And that reconsideration bought time, years, decades, enough for Moldavia to remain independent for another generation, for neighboring kingdoms to prepare, for the psychological grip of Ottoman invincibility to loosen. Most medieval battles are footnotes in history. Vaslui is studied 5 centuries later because it proved something that still matters. Empires can be resisted. Numbers don't guarantee victory. And sometimes the greatest act of leadership is choosing the terrible option that keeps your people free over the comfortable option that leads to enslavement. Stephen II died in 1504, at the age of 71, after 47 years of continuous warfare. His country had been burned, rebuilt, burned again, rebuilt again. His people had suffered losses no chronicle can fully capture, but Moldavia still existed. And that was the whole point. If this story is different from your usual historical content, if you've read this far and are still pondering frozen valleys and impossible decisions, do me a favor. Share it, not for the algorithm, but because there are people who need to hear that resistance is not futile, that small does not mean powerless, that brilliant strategy and absolute commitment can overcome overwhelming odds. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Real history, unvarnished, just the decisions that shaped the world, and the people who paid for them. And leave a comment. Tell me what you think. What would you have done in Stephen's place? Would you burn your own country to save it? I read every single comment, and honestly, this is the kind of story worth debating. Thanks for watching.